There were two children in that house. You already know which one you were. You knew before the question finished forming, because some part of you has been quietly answering it your whole life. In the way you stand inside a room, in the way you measure the temperature of a voice before you measure the words, in the way you can still feel the weight of someone else's mood pressing against the inside of your chest as if it belonged to you. You were the one who watched. You were the one who learned to read the small shifts in the air the way other people read the weather. You were the one whose body became an instrument tuned to the suffering of the people who were supposed to be tuning themselves to you. And somewhere in that same house, or one very much like it, there was another child, a child who shared the same wound, the same disappointment, the same hunger that was never quite fed. A sibling, perhaps a cousin, a version of you in a different bedroom, in a different city, living the same incomprehensible weather. And that other child did not become what you became. That other child took the same impossible situation and made an opposite shape from it, where you turned inward and grew soft skin that could feel through walls. They turned outward and grew a harder surface that could not be reached, where you became the one who carried everyone. They became the one who could not be carried by anyone, where you became unbearably aware of what other people felt. They became magnificently unaware, and for a long time you were taught, by everyone and by no one, that the difference between you and them was a difference of character. That you were the good one and they were the difficult one. That you were the sensitive one and they were the cold one. That you had a heart and they did not. You believed it. Of course you believed it. The story was offered to you so early and so often, and you needed a story, because the alternative, that two children could meet the same wound and become opposites, was too strange to hold. So you took the simpler version. You were the empath, they were the narcissist. You loved too much, they could not love at all. You felt everything, they felt nothing, and underneath that simpler story, a quieter exhaustion has been gathering for years. Because somewhere in you, you have always sensed that the simpler story is not quite true. It is not quite true that they feel nothing. It is not quite true that you feel more than they do. It is not quite true that the difference is a difference of soul. Through a Jungian lens, the difference is a difference of strategy. Two children facing the same unbearable air, and each child reaching out with the only small hand they had, and each hand closing around a different way of surviving the same impossibility. One hand learned to open, one hand learned to close, and neither child chose. That is the part that has been waiting to be said to you. Neither child chose. The wound was the same. The wound was a parent or a household or a climate that could not meet the child's actual need. Not because the parent was a monster, not always, but because the parent was already empty, or already preoccupied, or already drowning in their own unfinished life, and the child arrived asking for something the parent did not have to give. And the child, being a child, did not know that the absence belonged to the parent. The child only knew there was a hunger, and the hunger was being received as a problem. The child only knew that the room did not soften when they entered it. The child only knew that something about their wanting was wrong. And here the two paths begin to part, not from temperament, though temperament whispered in the background, not from goodness, though one child was later called good, from something more primitive and more practical. Each child made a small unconscious calculation about where the love might be hiding, and each child built a personality around that calculation. You looked at the parent and you concluded, somewhere below thought, that if you became exquisitely useful, exquisitely attuned, exquisitely good at sensing what they needed before they named it, you might earn the warmth that had been withheld. You concluded that the way to be loved was to disappear into the other person's weather and become indispensable to it. So you grew the long antennae, you grew the heart that could feel through walls, you grew the body that flinched in advance. The other child made a different calculation in the same house. The other child looked at the same parent and concluded, somewhere below thought, that if love was this dangerous, this conditional, this likely to vanish, then the only safe move was to stop needing it, not to stop wanting it, because the wanting could not be stopped, but to bury the wanting so deep that even they could not find it, to build a self that did not require anyone, to grow a hard outer wall around the same hunger you carried softly, to replace the longing for love with the pursuit of mirrors, because a mirror cannot abandon you the way a person can, the one whose shadow you would later carry, in Jungian terms, was a child who could not face their own dependency, and so they constructed a self that could not need. You were both starving. You ate by feeding others. They ate by being reflected. Two desperate solutions to the same emptiness. And the cruelty of the configuration is that the two solutions fit together like a lock and a key. The child who learned to feel everything is the perfect companion for the child who learned to feel nothing, because the one who feels everything will provide the reflection. The other one cannot generate on their own. You were not opposites. You were complements. You were the answer to each other's strategy. And that is why, decades later, you keep finding people who feel like that other child, and why something in you walks toward them with a recognition you cannot explain. There is a difficult tenderness in this. It is easier to think of yourself as the good child and them as the bad one, because the good and bad story protects you from the harder truth. The harder truth is that you and they were both children. The harder truth is that you and they were both responding to something that should never have asked a child to respond at all. The harder truth is that the wound did not produce one good person and one ruined person. The wound produced two adaptations, and both adaptations cost the child their wholeness. You paid for your adaptation by losing your right to exist without justifying yourself. They paid for theirs by losing their access to the part of them that could be reached. Different costs, the same lost child underneath. And here, before any of this becomes a thought about them, it has to become a thought about you, because the work of recognizing this is not the work of forgiving the other one. That can come later, or not at all. The work is closer in. The work is noticing that the empath self you have carried for so long was not your soul. It was your strategy. It was the shape you took because the room could not hold any other shape. And the strategy worked. That is the first piece of dignity to lay down here. The strategy worked. It kept you in the room. It earned you the small portions of warmth that were available. It made you survivable to the people who could only love you when you were useful to them. It was not weakness. It was not foolishness. It was a child making the most intelligent move available, and then growing up still making that same move, because no one ever told the child that the room had changed. But the strategy has begun to fail you. That is why you are here, listening to this. At whatever hour this is for you, some part of you has started to notice that the antennae do not switch off. Some part of you has started to notice that the caring has not produced the love it was supposed to earn. Some part of you has started to notice that the people who learn to receive what you give never learn to give it back. And some part of you, the quietest part, has started to wonder whether you were ever an empath at all, or whether you were simply a child who was not allowed to stop scanning the air. That question is not a betrayal of who you are. It is the first soft door. It is the moment the old role looks back at you and does not quite recognize itself in your face anymore. It is the beginning of the long, gentle separation between the self that was built to survive that house and the self that was buried underneath the building. The empath you have been is not nothing. It is real. It is yours. It carries enormous gifts that the other child could not develop. But it is not the whole of you, and it was never meant to answer for the whole of you for 40 or 50 or 60 years. There is grief in this. There has to be, because to see your sensitivity as a strategy is to see at the same time that some other life was lived around it and not through it. To see that the other child, the one you were taught, was cold, was carrying the same wound in a closed hand, is to lose the simple story that has organized your understanding of yourself since you were small. The villain becomes a child again. The hero becomes a child again. The house becomes the thing that shaped them both, instead of the stage on which one of them shone. That is a lot to set down in one evening. You do not have to set it down all at once. The recognition has already begun. The recognition is enough for now. Something old in the room has just noticed itself being seen. The room had a temperature long before you had words for temperature. That is where the explanation has to begin. Because the mind keeps wanting to start the story at the moment two children turned out differently, as if the divergence were the event. The divergence was the consequence. The event was earlier. The event was the climate of the house itself, the unspoken pressure that had already settled into the walls before either child arrived. The emotional weather that the parents were not generating on purpose and could not have stopped generating if they had tried. In the language of depth psychology, the children were not raised by what the parents said. The children were raised by what the parents had not yet faced in themselves. This is the piece the simpler story leaves out. The parent who could not meet you was not withholding on purpose. The parent was carrying their own unmet child, and that unmet child took up most of the available room in their psyche. And what was left over was the small flickering attention that fell on you and your sibling like uneven light through a curtain. Sometimes the light landed on one of you, sometimes the light landed on the other, sometimes the light landed on nothing at all. And the two of you, being small and intelligent in the way only small creatures can be intelligent, began to study the light. You both wanted to be standing where it would fall next. You differed only in the method you developed for chasing it. One method was to make yourself so soft that the light would want to rest on you. The other method was to make yourself so bright that the light would have no choice but to find you. Both methods are answers to the same scarcity. Both children were budgeting an inheritance that should never have been a budget. And here is where the Jungian frame begins to do its slow, careful work, because what looks like two personalities is actually two arrangements of the same psychic material, the same hunger, the same unmet longing for a steady mirror, the same early conclusion that love would not arrive on its own and would have to be engineered. In the language of the unconscious, each of you formed what might be called a complex around the same wound, but the complex organized itself in opposite directions. A complex is not a flow. A complex is the way the psyche groups together everything it learned around a single unbearable place. so that the unbearable place does not have to be visited directly. Your complex pulled you toward people. Their complex pushed people away. Your complex told you that safety lived in proximity, in being so close to the other person's inner life that you could anticipate it. Their complex told them that safety lived in distance, in being so untouchable that no one could ever again reach in and disappoint them. Two doors out of the same room. One door opened outward into other people. The other door opened inward into a sealed chamber where only the self could enter. And both doors led away from the child who had been there before either door existed. That is the part the mind resists. You think you walked through your door and became more yourself. They walked through their door and became less themselves. But from the perspective of the buried child, both doors were exits. Both doors took the original child somewhere else and left the constructed self standing in the doorway. The empath is not the original child. The empath is what the original child built to keep the original child alive. And the one you call the narcissist is also not the original child. They are what the other original child built to keep that original child alive. Two constructions, each one believing it was the real face, each one having forgotten the small, unguarded face it was built to protect. You can feel this if you turn the attention inward for a moment. Underneath the long history of feeling everyone else, there is a child who was not feeling everyone else. There was a moment, very early, before the antennae fully extended, when you simply wanted something for yourself and reached for it without checking whether the reach was permitted. You cannot quite remember that moment. The remembering apparatus does not store it well, because the moment was overwritten almost immediately by the response it received. Whatever the response was, it taught you that wanting something for yourself was not the safest move. And so the next reach went outward, toward what the other person seemed to want, because giving turned out to be safer than asking. The strategy began. The original reach was filed away as too dangerous to repeat. The other child, in the other bedroom, had their own original reach. Their reach was not so different from yours. They too wanted to be seen as themselves, not as a function of someone else's need. They too reached out for a love that would not require them to earn it. And their reach met the same kind of response yours met. But they read the response differently, where you concluded that the way to survive was to become more attuned. They concluded that the way to survive was to become more impressive, where you decided that love would be earned through service. They decided that love would be extracted through being remarkable, where you adapted by lowering yourself into other people. They adapted by lifting themselves above other people, and in both cases, the child stopped being a child and became a project. Your project was to be needed, their project was to be admired. Two careers, the same buried longing for the simple thing neither child got, which was to be loved without having to perform. Through a depth psychology lens, what your sibling carried, what the person you keep encountering carries, is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of feeling that has been sealed away so completely that even they cannot reach it. The shadow, in the Jungian sense, is not the dark side of the personality in some moral way. The shadow is everything the personality could not afford to keep visible. For you, the shadow contains your own need, your own anger, your own right to be the one who is taken care of. For them, the shadow contains the opposite. Their shadow contains the very softness, the very dependency, the very vulnerability that you were allowed to express. They could not afford softness, So they sealed it, and the sealing was not done by an adult who knew what they were doing. The sealing was done by a child who had no other tool. This is why the encounter between you and that kind of person carries such strange gravity. You meet them, and something in you recognizes them at a depth that has no name. It is not because they are your destiny. It is because you are looking at the half of the wound that you did not carry. They are looking at the half of the wound they did not carry, which is you. From a Jungian perspective, you are each other's shadow. You hold their disowned softness, and they hold your disowned hardness. You feel their unfelt feelings for them, because their feeling apparatus has been disabled, and feelings still need to live somewhere. They demonstrate the unapologetic taking that you were never allowed to demonstrate, because your taking apparatus has been disabled, and the right to take still needs to live somewhere. You complete each other in a way that is not love. It is more like two halves of a single sealed economy. The economy is exhausting from the inside. It looks from a distance, as if one of you is giving and the other is taking, and the simpler story names that exchange unfair. The exchange is unfair. The exchange is also more symmetrical than it appears. They are taking what you have agreed to give, because their psyche was structured to take and yours was structured to give. The transaction is the only transaction either of you knew how to make. Neither of you is performing it because you are evil and the other is good. You are performing it because, in the original house, no other transaction was available, and you both learned the only one that was. Decades later, you are still inside the transaction, with people who are not even the original people, in rooms that are not even the original room, repeating the only exchange your psyches were trained to perform. The recognition of this is not a release. The recognition is a kind of mourning. There is no clean villain to blame for the long carrying. There is only a configuration that was set in place before either of you could refuse it. Your sibling, or whoever now occupies the place your sibling once occupied in your life, is not the cause of your exhaustion. They are the partner in a pattern. The pattern is the cause, and the pattern was authored originally by the climate of a house that could not give either child what either child needed. So the children divided the unmet need between them and built personalities around their halves. You took the half that says, I will feel for both of us. They took the half that says, I will not feel for either of us. And the two halves walked through the years together, sometimes in the same family, sometimes in the same marriage, sometimes only in the same haunting, always in some version of the same room. You can feel the room around you now. Even if you are not in the original room, the body remembers it. The chest remembers the way it used to compress when the front door opened. The shoulders remember the small lift they used to perform when a particular footstep approached. The stomach remembers the way it would tighten when a voice took on a certain texture. These are not metaphors. These are residues. The original climate left its weather inside you, and the weather did not stop when you left the house. It went with you. It is still organizing some of your rooms now, deciding which voices you flinch from, deciding which silences you fill, deciding which kinds of people you walk toward without quite knowing why. To understand this is not yet to be free of it. Understanding alone does not release the body. The body has its own slower timeline, but understanding is the lamp brought into the dark room. Without the lamp, the configuration runs in the background and looks like fate. With the lamp, the configuration becomes visible as a configuration. which means it stops being fate and starts being a structure. Structures can be set with, structures can be questioned, structure can eventually loosen, not because you force them to, because once they are seen, they stop having the same uninterrupted power they had when they were unseen. The empath role and the role you have called narcissism are both structures. They are not souls. They are the shapes two children made out of the same unbearable air. And the air, finally, is what asks to be named. The air in that house was made of something the children could not name. And so the children named themselves instead. You called yourself sensitive. They called themselves strong. Neither name was wrong. Exactly. Each name was a true description of a real adaptation, but the names belonged to the adaptations, not to the children underneath. And once the names took hold, they began to do something the children had not anticipated. The names began to feel like identity. The strategy became the self. The shape you took to survive the room became the shape you mistook for who you were. And once that mistake was made, it became almost impossible to undo without going through something that has, for a long time, felt like betrayal. Because here is the part that has been waiting in the wings of this conversation. And it has to be said carefully, because saying it carelessly would only add another wound to the carrying. The empath self was not only a survival, it was also, somewhere along the way, a position. It came with a place to stand. It came with a way of being known. It came with a quiet, almost invisible authority, because the one who feels for everyone becomes the one without whom the room does not function. You became necessary, and necessary is not the same as loved. But for a child who could not get loved, necessary was the nearest available substitute. The role paid you in a currency you could not refuse. That is the sentence that needed to be set down here. And it is not an accusation. It is a recognition. The role paid you, not in love, which is what you actually wanted, but in something close enough to love that the difference could be overlooked for years. The role paid you in being indispensable. It paid you in knowing what other people needed before they did, which is a quiet form of power even when it does not feel like power. It paid you in being the one the family called when something difficult happened, which gave you a place in the family even when no one was looking at you directly. It paid you in the small warmth of being thanked, even though the thanks always came after the labor and never instead of it. The currency was real. It just was not the currency you originally asked for. And because the currency was real, some part of you began, without ever choosing to depend on receiving it, not in the way the simpler stories describe, where the giver is portrayed as foolish or weak. In a quieter way, you learned that being needed was reliable, and being known was not. And so you began to organize your relationships around the more reliable one. You began to walk into rooms already scanning for what you could provide, because providing was the move that had always worked. You began to befriend people who needed you more than they saw you, because being needed was familiar and being seen was not. And you began, somewhere very deep, to feel a small and almost imperceptible discomfort when someone tried to give to you without asking anything back. The giving without an exchange did not fit the economy you knew. It felt, strangely, like a kind of unsafety, because if they were not taking, you did not yet know what you were for. This is the shadow piece. Not that you are secretly selfish, not that your generosity was a manipulation, nothing so blunt. The shadow piece is gentler and more painful than that. The shadow piece is that being needed felt safer than being known. And so, without ever deciding to, you arranged a life in which you were continuously needed and rarely known. You did not do this because you were broken. You did this because the original room taught you that being known was where the danger lived. The original room taught you that the moment you let someone see what you actually wanted, that was the moment the disappointment arrived. So you stopped letting them see. You let them see only what you could give, and the giving made you visible without ever quite making you exposed. The giving was a brilliant compromise. It kept you in the room and kept the original child hidden at the same time. The other one, the one whose shadow you carried, made the opposite compromise. They could not bear to be needed, because being needed felt like being trapped. They could not bear to be unseen, because being unseen felt like being erased. So they arranged a life in which they were continuously admired and rarely needed. They became impressive instead of indispensable, and in the same way that your compromise hid your hunger inside your usefulness, their compromise hid their hunger inside their performance. Both of you became unreachable in opposite directions. You were unreachable because no one ever asked what was underneath the giving. They were unreachable because no one was ever allowed close enough to ask what was underneath the brightness. The original child, in both cases, sat alone in a small room behind the constructed self, holding the question no one ever asked. The shadow moment is not the discovery that you are bad. The shadow moment is the discovery that you have been receiving something for the role you played, and that the receiving has been one of the reasons the role has lasted so long. It is the discovery that you were not only a victim of the arrangement, you were also, quietly, a participant in it, not because you wanted to be, because the arrangement was the only economy you knew, and any economy, once you are inside it, has to be participated in to function. You participated, they participated, the original house participated through both of you. Decades after the original house was gone, and the recognition of that participation is not a verdict. It is a doorway, because the moment you can see that the role paid you, the role begins to lose its monopoly on what you are willing to receive. This is where the slow, almost invisible work of separating from the role begins. Not by becoming the opposite, not by deciding to stop giving and start taking. That swing would only be the same economy with the signs reversed, which is what happens when people overcorrect out of the empath role and into a brittle version of the other child's strategy. The work is more subtle. The work is to notice, when you feel the pull to provide, that the pull might not be coming from your actual care in this moment. It might be coming from the older economy, the one that learned that providing was how you stayed safe, and to notice the pull without obeying it, not to refuse to give, just to notice that the giving is currently being requested by the old strategy, and to ask, very quietly, whether the giving is what this present moment actually calls for, or whether the old room is making the decision for you again. There will be a small grief when you begin to notice this, because you will see, with a clarity that is hard to refuse, how many of your relationships were built on the older economy. You will see the friendships in which the other person never quite asked who you were, because you never quite gave them the chance, because letting them ask would have required you to stop providing for long enough to be seen. You will see the romantic histories in which the other person needed you in a way that felt like love and was actually something simpler. and you will see how willing you were to accept the simpler thing, because the simpler thing did not require you to risk the harder thing. You will see, perhaps most painfully, the relationships with family members in which you played the role of the one who manages everyone's feelings. And you will see how much of your identity inside that family depends on continuing to play it. None of this means the relationships were not real. The love inside them was real. The connection was real. The care you gave was real. The receiving of you, in whatever partial form it occurred, was also real. The grief is not that the relationships were fake. The grief is that they were arranged in a particular way, and the arrangement protected something in you that has been ready for a long time now to step out from behind the arrangement and be met directly. The arrangement was not the enemy. The arrangement was the cradle, and cradles eventually become too small. Through the lens of depth psychology, what is happening in you now is what might be called the loosening of the persona. The persona is the public face. The psyche constructs to move through the world. It is not a lie. It is a necessary mask. The trouble is not that you developed a persona. Everyone develops one. The trouble is that your persona became so successful, so well rewarded, so deeply identified with your sense of being a good person, that the original self underneath it has had no room to breathe. And the original self, the one who existed before the strategy, has begun very quietly to ask for the room back. It is not asking loudly. It is asking through the exhaustion. It is asking through the moments when you give and feel emptier afterwards. It is asking through the strange, almost unbearable feeling of being thanked for the 1000th time by someone who has never asked how you are. It is asking through the small flicker of resentment that arrives and that you immediately push back down, because resentment is not allowed in the empath role. The resentment is not a flaw. The resentment is the original child finally beginning to speak. The original child is saying, in the only language available to them after this many years of silence, that the economy has cost them something, that the giving was not free, that the role has been carrying a weight no one ever helped them carry. And the resentment, if it is allowed to be present without being acted on, can become something more refined than resentment. It can become the small, clear sense of what you actually want, which is the thing you stopped knowing somewhere around the age of 6. You stopped knowing because you needed to stop knowing in order to keep the strategy intact. And now, decades later, the knowing is trying to return, and it is bringing some discomfort with it, because remembering what you want is the first move toward no longer being available for what you do not want. This is the threshold the shadow opens onto, not a revelation, not a healing, a threshold. The room is still there, the role is still there, the economy is still there, but something behind all of them has begun to take up its own small space. And the space is not going to give itself back. The original child has begun to occupy the air the empath role used to occupy entirely, and what is being asked of you now is not to throw away the empath, who was, after all, the one who kept the original child alive through impossible weather. What is being asked is to let the empath become one room in the house instead of the whole house, to let it serve when serving is what this present moment actually needs, and to let it rest when the present moment is asking for something else, something you have not yet practiced offering, yourself, perhaps unprovided, unperformed, simply present, with nothing to give and nothing to extract. in a room that is finally beginning to belong to you. A room that belongs to you is a strange room at first. It does not feel like victory. It does not feel like arrival. It feels, more than anything, like a kind of unfamiliar quiet, because for the first time the room is not being scanned for someone else's needs. The antennae are still there. They will be there for a long time. They may be there for the rest of your life, but they are no longer the only instrument by which you measure whether you are safe to be present. Something else has begun to measure, something that does not require the constant intake of other people's weather in order to know where it stands, something that can sit in a chair without already calculating whether the chair is positioned correctly for whoever else might enter. You may notice, in the small hours of an ordinary day, that you have done something simple without checking. You may have eaten something you wanted without first considering whether anyone else preferred it. You may have answered a question with what you actually thought, instead of with what would land most softly. You may have let a phone call go unanswered, not out of avoidance, but out of the small and almost forgotten right to not be available in this particular minute. And after these moments you may feel a small flicker of guilt, because the old economy still believes that any movement away from continuous provision is a kind of theft. The guilt is not a sign that you have done something wrong. The guilt is a residue. The old economy is filing its complaint. You do not have to settle the complaint. You only have to notice that the complaint is being filed by a self that is no longer the only self you have. The other one, the one whose shadow you carried for so long, is somewhere out in the world, still performing their version of the same exhaustion. Or they are not, or they have died, or moved away, or stopped speaking to you, or remained too close. Whatever their current location, the work that is happening in you is no longer dependent on what is happening in them. That is one of the quieter griefs of this whole recognition. You used to believe, without saying it, that the changing of your situation required the changing of them, that if they could finally see what they had done, if they could finally apologize, if they could finally meet you as an equal, then the carrying would lift. It has been one of the longest waits of your life. And the recognition arriving now is that the waiting was itself a continuation of the role. The role required them to eventually wake up so that the role could finally be set down. And the role can be set down now while they are still asleep. The role can be set down without their participation. That is the unexpected freedom inside this. The release does not require their consent. It does not require their punishment either. This is the part where the simpler stories about wounded people and the people who wounded them tend to fail, because the simpler stories want a verdict at the end. Someone has to be condemned. Someone has to be vindicated. The balance has to be struck. The Jungian arc does not strike that balance. The Jungian arc allows both children to be seen as children, both adaptations to be seen as adaptations, both costs to be felt without one cost cancelling the other. You do not have to forgive them in order to be released. You do not have to refuse to forgive them in order to be released. The release is not connected to the verdict. The release is connected to the moment you no longer need a verdict in order to live your own life. The other one can be however they are. You are no longer the room they get to live in. There will still be the residues. The body will still remember the original climate. There will still be afternoons when a particular tone of voice arrives from someone else, and your chest tightens before your mind has caught up. There will still be evenings when you find yourself, without meaning to, anticipating what someone wants before they have spoken, and offering it before they have asked. These are not failures. These are the long, slow, unhurried memory of a child who learned to survive in a particular way. The child is not gone. The child is being slowly accompanied by an adult who finally sees the child and does not require the child to keep performing. The performances will diminish. They will not stop entirely. The work is not to stop them. The work is to notice them with something like tenderness and to choose, in some of the moments, not to obey. The new self that is forming through this process is not a more closed version of you. That is one of the easy mistakes the mind wants to make at this point. To assume that the cure for being too open is to become more guarded. The mind wants symmetry. The psyche does not move in symmetries. The psyche moves toward wholeness. And wholeness is not the opposite of the empath role. Wholeness is the empath role placed inside a larger self, where it is one capacity among many, available when it serves and quiet when it does not. The same sensitivity that used to make you a permanent receiver can become, in a more integrated form, a deep and precise instrument that you direct rather than one that directs you. The gift was always real. The gift just was never meant to be the whole of who you are. And the other gift, the one you never developed because the other child took it, may begin very slowly to arrive. The capacity to want without justifying the wanting, the capacity to take up space without apologizing for the taking, the capacity to refuse something without explaining the refusal in 3 different ways to make sure no one is hurt. These do not come quickly, and they do not come comfortably. They come in small and almost laughable increments. You say no to something small. You receive a compliment without deflecting it. You let a silence sit between you and another person without filling it. Each of these is a tiny recovery of the original child, who was not only sensitive, but also alive in their own right, with their own hungers and their own preferences and their own refusals. The original child is being returned to you in pieces. The pieces arrive when they arrive. What can be said now, at this hour of the recognition, is that the simpler story you began with has quietly loosened. You started with 2 children, one good and one bad, one feeling and one cold, one wounded into love and one wounded into something less than love. You will end somewhere different. You will end with 2 children who met the same impossible air and made opposite small shapes inside it, both shapes costing them their wholeness, both shapes lasting longer than they were supposed to last, both shapes eventually asking, in different ways, to be released. You may never speak this aloud to the other one. You may never speak it aloud to yourself in exactly these words again. But something has shifted in the way you hold the original story. And the shift will continue to settle slowly, the way light settles in a room after the lamp has been moved. The room is still there. The room will always be there in some form. The original climate is part of what shaped you, and that shaping cannot be unshaped, only understood and accompanied. But the room is no longer the only room. There is this room, the one you are in now, wherever you are, with whatever is around you at this hour. There is the room of the present moment, which is a smaller room than the original house, and a quieter one, and one in which the air is not asking you to perform anything in order to remain in it. You can simply be in this room. You can put down, for the duration of this hour, the long inventory of other people's weather that you have been keeping in the background of your attention. The inventory will still be there tomorrow if you want to pick it back up. It does not have to be carried tonight. And the one you used to think of as the opposite of you, the one whose name brought so much heat into your chest for so many years, can be allowed to recede into a smaller corner of your inner room, not erased, not forgiven on demand, just resized. They were a child too, in a house that could not hold either of you, and they made a shape out of the unbearable air that has cost them something you will never see. They will live their version of the cost, you will live yours. The two costs do not have to meet again in order for yours to begin softening. Yours can soften here, in this small room, on this ordinary night, while you listen to a voice that has named the configuration you have been living inside for longer than you knew there was a configuration. There is no final understanding to reach. There is no last insight that finishes this. The empath role will not vanish, and the original child will not arrive all at once. The work, if it can even be called work, is the slow accompanying of one by the other, over years that will not announce themselves as years. What can happen tonight is smaller and more durable than a transformation. Something old can stop asking to be carried for an hour. Something young can be allowed to take up a little more room than it has been allowed before. The configuration does not end. The grip of the configuration loosens. You came into this hour believing, on some level, that you were the good child and they were the difficult one. You may leave this hour believing something quieter and harder, that you were both children, that the wound was the same, that the masks were different, that the masks have been worn long enough, and that the one underneath the mask, the one who was there before the strategy began, has been waiting for you all this time, in a room that was always yours, with nothing to give and nothing to perform, asking only to be sat with, finally, by the self that was built to keep them safe. The caring did not end. The need to explain it did.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.